If you followed Formula One for any amount of time at all, there's a really good chance you've heard of the 1982 driver strike, where the full field of F1 drivers gathered together in a ballroom of a hotel in South Africa with some mattresses and some blankets and one major mission in mind. They were boycotting the season opening race in South Africa until the FIA would change its super license agreement. But what actually happened? And what were they actually protesting? See, that is what I am here to tell you today. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and I am an award-winning motorsport journalist and historian. This year, I am taking you behind the scenes in the motorsport world to show you how this sport kind of evolved and came to be. And today, we are talking about that 1982 driver strike. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, the whole thing came down to two clauses in their super license agreement that drivers were given to sign at the start of the year. As you know, a super license is the name of the license that is required to compete in Formula One. Today, drivers earn this license by accumulating a certain number of points while they are competing in lower tier divisions like Formula 2 or even IndyCar, and or by taking part in free practice 1 sessions in an F1 car. If you get enough points, you are able to qualify for a license. You still have to go through some testing to make sure that you actually know how to handle a car and also understand the rules of Formula 1, but at that point you should be able to get it pretty easily. But back in the 80s, the super license itself was kind of more informal. You still needed one to compete in the sport, since the FIA wanted to kind of professionalize what Formula One was becoming, but you didn't have to compete in lower divisions. There wasn't all of this math or formulas that you had to do to see how many points you acquired. In fact, heading into the 1982 season, existing drivers were basically just handed the super license agreement to sign, and that was that. Well, aside from a few of those pesky clauses that some of the drivers spotted pretty quickly. See, one of the problems, and this was a fairly minor one in kind of the grand scope of things, but still important, is that drivers were not allowed to speak ill of the FIA or Formula One. But the real problem was this second clause that said super licenses were only valid for 3 years, aka during a period of time which drivers had signed to a specific team. It's kind of hard to conceptualize that, so let's talk about it in a modern example. Let's use Max Verstappen here as an example. We know that he's currently contracted to Red Bull Racing through 2028, but it is highly likely that there are some clauses in there that would say if there's performance issues or something, he can kind of break that contract and go somewhere else. But so long as he continues to be an F1 driver, he will continue to qualify for a super license, and that super license will carry with him wherever he goes next. In 1982, the problem was that the super licenses were going to be tied kind of explicitly to your contract with a specific team. In contemporary terms, with our Verstappen example, that would mean as soon as he left Red Bull, his super license contract would completely expire. And if he wanted to race for a different team, then the FIA would have to grant him that super license again. I think that in and of itself should kind of explain why drivers were not a fan of this new super license rule. But you should also remember that time in history, contracts were way more flexible. So a driver could sign up to race for a team all season long, but if he was disappointed in the car performance, or if he spotted a better opportunity elsewhere, he could cut ties and move. It'd be like, for example, Verstappen leaving Red Bull mid-season for Ferrari because Ferrari made him a better offer and the car looked a lot better. It's almost incomprehensible now, but it was much more common in F1's past. But to make things even more complicated, tensions were already so high between F1's governing body, which we know today is the FIA, but back then was called FISA, and plenty of the drivers and teams who had joined together in a little organization called FOCA. Now, if you are interested in learning more about this battle between these two organizations, I have a 2-part feature on my Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys podcast. But if you want to get into the nitty-gritty, that is where you will find all of the details, but let me sum it up here quick for the purpose of the video. FISA was run by a gentleman named Jean-Marie Balestre, who had very strong beliefs about Formula One and what it should be. Namely, he felt it should be a continental European sport that preserved the kind of French heritage and history of Formula One racing and Grand Prix racing in general. And he believed that complete control of that sport should rest in the hands of FISA, the sport's sanctioning body. But historically, that is not how F1 has worked. See, early F1 calendars were largely pieced together from a set of already existing events, many of which had been hosting Grand Prix for decades. So as a result, all of those little events were operating independently from each other. If you showed up in Monaco, you could expect one set of rules, but those rules were probably going to be different when you got to Belgium. And the same went for things like prize money. That's because Monaco was hosted by the Royal Automobile Club of Monaco, and Belgium by the Belgian Automobile Club. And yes, these were all events in the Formula One calendar as a whole, but they were basically allowed to operate as they had done all those years before F1. F1 just kind of put a championship at the end of it to say, based on how you performed, you'll win a prize, a trophy. For some continental teams, the likes of which, Ferrari, Renault, Italian manufacturers, French manufacturers, the ones who are headquartered in Europe proper, that was generally pretty fine. But as British teams started to get more involved in F1, we started to see some problems. Now imagine it's 1960 and you're the organizer of the French Grand Prix. Obviously, you want a nice healthy field of competitors, but what you really want is spectators turning up in droves paying ticket fees. That means you need to ensure that the competitors are quality competitors, the drivers that folks want to come out and see. As the organizer of the race, it is your responsibility to make it worthwhile for those competitors to turn up, so you offer them travel money to get to the race, starting money to ensure they compete, and prize money for their performance. And if you were the French Grand Prix and it was taking place at Reims, you also were throwing in boxes and boxes and boxes of champagne too. But you're not going to treat every team equally because you don't have to treat every team equally. So you really want Ferrari to show up because everyone, who doesn't want to see Ferrari competing? So you offer Ferrari, say, $1,000 in travel funds and $1,000 in starting money. But even more than that, Ferrari expects that nice hefty offer because they've been around for decades. They've been racing in these events since before there was a Formula One. But it's 1960, and there are plenty of little British teams popping up like Cooper, Lotus, BRM, and Van Wall. And you'll need them to come flesh out the field because there aren't enough continental teams to do so. But you're also not desperate to have those teams show up because they're not the ones that are drawing fans. So you'll offer those British teams, say, $200 in travel money and $200 in starting money. And since those teams are really keen on getting their foot in the door in F1, they will accept the offer. You can see how this probably wouldn't be a sustainable mindset for very long. And later in the 1960s, those British teams were getting tired of getting the short end of the stick. So they banded together in a loose coalition that they called the Formula One Constructors Association. That allowed them to exert a stronger bargaining power. All of a sudden, Cooper, Lotus, and BRM were calling up the organizers of the French Grand Prix and telling them that they weren't going to bother turning up for the race if they didn't get a better cut of the travel and entry money. After all, they were traveling farther distances to get to Continental Grand Prix, and these teams were also proving to be of championship material with great drivers. If the French organizers said no, they'd end up with a sparse starting field, which would not impress the fans and would harm the integrity and overall prize purse of the race. So they kind of had to say yes. As the years went on, more of these teams turned up. Outfits that you might still recognize today, Tyrrell, Brabham, McLaren, and March. As their number increased, so did their power over F1 organizers, and that particularly ramped up when folks like Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley got involved in these kind of higher up positions negotiating these deals. In the meantime, those continental teams were shrinking in numbers. For a while, it was just Ferrari, though as the 1970s melted into the 80s, you had the addition of Renault and Alfa Romeo. We're talking about a pretty tiny amount of teams compared to British-based teams, but that really, really bothered the folks at the FIA, particularly Jean-Marie Balestre. And throughout the 70s and early 80s, the FIA was regularly butting heads with the FOCA-aligned teams over everything from prize money to circuit safety to technical and sporting regulations. You had threats of boycotts, countless meetings, races stripped of their championship status, and even the threat of a breakaway series that could have split Formula One in two. Let me know if you want to know more about that, because that whole saga itself is fascinating. Let me know in the comments. So anyway, this all brings us back to the driver strike in 1982 and those pesky super license clauses that would have prevented drivers from speaking ill of the championship or swapping teams midway through the season. That swapping teams clause was part of the FIA's effort to keep drivers and teams in check, and our guy, Niki Lauda, was not going to have it. Niki Lauda, you probably know him as a 3-time Formula One world champion. At this point in time, he had retired back in 1979 to focus on running his airline, only to kind of end up dipping a toe into Formula One as a commentator and then traveling to a bunch of races. And then he kind of realized that he still wanted to compete. So he entered Formula One again in 1982 before he would go on to win that third championship. He inked a deal with McLaren, and on Christmas in 1981, his super license contract arrived at his doorstep. He was all set to sign until he read those pesky clauses. Lauda was appalled. He was upset. He rang up fellow racer Didier Pironi, who was serving as the president of the Grand Prix Drivers Association at the time. The GPDA, still a little similar to the GPDA that exists today, but was basically there to bargain for driver rights. Pironi explained to him that, yeah, he was aware of those clauses and that they had been agreed upon between the GPDA and the FIA earlier in December. Did Lauda accept that as an answer? Not even slightly. By the end of the call, he had managed to convince Pironi that those two clauses in the super license contract were unacceptable, and that the rest of the drivers intending to compete in 1982 needed to be called up now to be made aware of the issue so that they could refuse to sign. So when they hung up, Lauda and Pironi got on the phone and they started making those calls. Enter another problem. Of the 31 drivers who received the super license agreement, 24 had already signed and sent it back to the FIA in order to secure their place on the grid. The drivers who hadn't signed included Gilles Villeneuve, Bruno Giacomelli, Andrea De Cesaris, and René Arnoux. Did Pironi and Lauda take that as a sign that perhaps they should just sign and be done with it? Absolutely not. They would have to wait until the next time the F1 field was together in one place, at the South African Grand Prix in January of 1982, to make their next move. The race was scheduled to take place on January 23rd, 1982, and everyone who intended to compete needed to have their super license agreement signed and returned to the FIA. Obviously, 6 major players had not done so, and it meant that Didier Pironi called a meeting with FIA officials on the 20th, just prior to the start of the race weekend, in order to explain the concern that he and his fellow drivers had with that super license agreement. The FIA's response was not encouraging. Basically, they told Pironi that they wouldn't even begin to consider amending the super license rules until the FISA Executive Committee held its next meeting, which wasn't going to be for months, until after Formula One had returned to Europe. FIA President Jean-Marie Balestra informed Pironi that if he and his fellow drivers wanted to compete in South Africa, Brazil, and Long Beach, the races taking place before the European return, then he needed to sign the super license agreement. And if he did not, Balestra personally promised that their cars would fail scrutineering and would not be able to compete. Did that sit well with Lauda, Pironi, and the other members of the GPDA? I'm going to let you guess. Absolutely not. The first practice session of that weekend was set to take place on a Thursday, and that morning, as drivers turned up at the track, they discovered a large bus parked at the gate, commissioned by GPDA Secretary Trevor Rowe. Lauda and Pironi were there on site and made a point to speak to every single driver that morning, with the exception of Jochen Mass, who was staying somewhere else and didn't realize this whole thing was going on. And they discussed with the drivers kind of the problems with the super license issue. The FIA included some questionable clauses in their contract and were demanding every driver sign it now without having a genuine discussion with the GPDA, without any guarantees that those offending clauses would be edited or removed, and without any promises that anything would change in the future. Yes, there would be the FISA Executive Committee where this issue could theoretically be brought up, but if the drivers signed, then there was really no incentive for FISA to do anything in that committee. When the facts were laid out like that, it became clear to almost all of the field that the terms that they were signing onto were unacceptable. If they agreed, Lauda and Pironi directed them to the bus. Hop on and we'll shuttle you back to Sunnyside Park Hotel in Johannesburg because we're boycotting this race until someone talks to us. Of the 31 drivers who turned up in South Africa, 29 boarded the bus. Those drivers, along with plenty of journalists, headed straight for the hotel's ballroom and announced that they would be holding up inside until they were able to make some headway in their negotiations. Pironi remained at the track to continue pleading their case to Balestra and to Kyalami track owner Bobby Hartsleaf, and Lauda served as the main point of contact at the hotel. So Pironi would ring up Lauda, give him some updates. Lauda would let the folks in the ballroom know how things were progressing. The journalists would stick around with the drivers and bring them food so that no one needed to leave the room, and they were all kind of trying to figure out what the next steps are going to be. That day, it was very clear that the FIA was going to stick to its guns, so the drivers responded by filling the ballroom with mattresses and blankets with the intention of spending the night. They even barricaded the door to the ballroom so that team owners couldn't come in and plead with them or to threaten them to race. The goal was all about maintaining solidarity. Like, if a driver went back to his individual room, it would have been so easy to break down his defenses and convince him to race. But everyone banded together in the same room, and so it made it a whole lot harder to defect. In fact, Derek Warwick said the whole thing was fantastic because, quote, I got to know my colleagues for the first time because being a non-qualifier at the back of the grid, you don't get a chance to speak to the guys up front. They got to know each other very well because there weren't enough mattresses to go around, so the drivers had to share beds. And to keep themselves entertained, guys like Gilles Villeneuve and Elio De Angelis cranked out some tunes on the piano, and others made it a contest to crack the crassest joke. Everyone pretty much stuck to their guns, though it is rumored that Teo Fabi escaped from a bathroom window, basically out of concern for his future as an F1 driver, and I have to say not many folks were impressed with that one. Fabi was worried, because team owners were considering bringing in other drivers to prevent the South African Grand Prix from being cancelled. Bernie Ecclestone, who was in charge of Brabham at the time, fired both of his drivers, and claimed he had over 150 qualified drivers gunning to race in place of Riccardo Patrese and Nelson Piquet. Teams like ATS and Theodore actually hung notices on their cars in the paddock inviting local drivers to get behind the wheel, and FISA President Jean-Marie Balestre threatened lifetime bans on all of the drivers, while Kyalami's Bob Hartsleeve said, "You're all suspended from competing." But then it became clear that the drivers weren't going to back down, and they couldn't really get new drivers in quickly to replace them, so FISA and Hartsleeve had to give in. Before Friday practice kicked off, Hartsleeve negotiated with the teams, drivers, and the FIA to effectively hold off the negotiations until after the race. Drivers would therefore be able to compete in South Africa whether or not they'd signed the super license contract, and they were promised there would be no retaliation in the form of fines or suspensions later in the season. The drivers left the ballroom, boarded the bus, and headed to the track to get the 1982 season started. That was where Alain Prost of Renault took victory, and things seemed like they were going to be fine. Except there was indeed some backlash. Jean-Marie Balestre was incensed by the whole display, by the fact that they would even consider embarrassing him like this, and he was not the kind of man who was just going to sit there and accept that he lost a battle by allowing drivers to compete the rest of the season without repercussions. As a result, almost everyone who engaged in the strike was slapped with a fine, either $5,000 to $10,000, or a multi-race ban ranging from anywhere from 2 to 5 events. I think it should come as no surprise that the drivers just straight up refused to pay the fines and acknowledge the bans. That would become a major point of contention throughout the season, but ultimately the FIA Court of Appeal had to step in to say you can't actually punish the drivers like that, and they scrubbed the offending clauses from the super license contract as a whole. The 1982 driver strike was a frankly unique moment in Formula One history. In the past, drivers had threatened boycotts over inadequate safety, but it was also hard to organize every driver to get them on the same page. But that's exactly what happened in 82 when their super licenses were put under threat. It was a major watershed moment where drivers demanded that their value to F1 be respected, and we have not seen anything like it again. As 82 continued, there were more ongoing battles between the teams and the FIA pertaining to divergent regulatory interpretations, which led FOCA teams to boycott the San Marino Grand Prix. But by the end of the season, the spat kind of came to a sudden end. It looked like tensions were going to continue to rise, but instead they just petered out. Part of that absolutely has to come down to the fact that we saw so many tragedies that year in Formula One. Ferrari's Gilles Villeneuve was killed at Zolder. Shortly after, Riccardo Paletti was killed in Canada. And then after that, Didier Pironi suffered a career-ending injury in an F1 race. It's entirely possible that all of that petty infighting between the FOCA teams and FISA just felt trivial in comparison to the fact that this was a very dangerous sport. Part of it also came down to the fact that ground effect was banned, and ground effect was a major focus of the FOCA team's developments, to the detriment, actually, of the FISA-aligned teams. They eventually kind of realized the ban was coming, started focusing on developing in a different direction, and when the ban finally came into place after 1982, there was less to have to fight about. A lot of those major ideological differences just disappeared. But one thing is certain, the strike at Kyalami remains one of the most incredible moments in Formula One history. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel. Check out Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys on my podcast, wherever you get podcasts. It's on Substack and social media as well. And leave a comment. Let me know what kind of topics you want me to cover in the future. I am looking forward to really digging in this season. Thank you so much.